Dr. Christopher Lamont. Welcome to the Business Karaoke podcast for our Human-Centered AI sub-series. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to share a little bit about why I was really interested to hear your specific view and your lens of the world. As I was preparing for this, for our interview, my AI and I decided to call you the Lamont lens. This was the Lamont lens.
Interesting. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, hopefully I live up to that lens, or the lens is one that makes things clearer as opposed to...
So the Lamont lens. So
okay.
Let me share a little bit about, as I was kind of chatting and saying, this
Okay.
is why I'm really interested for Chris to come on. So for those of you that are thinking why I'm not calling Dr. Christopher Lamont Dr. Lamont, because Chris and I are also friends. So I'm allowed to call you Chris.
Yes, yeah. I prefer to be called Chris also. It's kind of, yeah.
I'm really interested when it comes to AI. So as you know, at
Yeah.
DTJ, we're human-centered AI, which means don't begin with the technology, begin with the human.
Right.
And I'm going to share with you a story that I heard recently, that was told to me recently, and then kind of how that then informs kind of our thinking. So
Okay.
one was, I was chatting with one of the professors from Grips University, so at the Graduate University for Policy Studies here in Japan, and we were chatting about AI and cybersecurity. And he said, I don't know why everyone is kind of jumping up and down about security now. And I was like, that's really interesting, because I think AI and security is probably like a really big issue.
Right.
And they said, do you want to expand more?
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean by that? And he said, 100 years ago, when you wanted to send a letter,
Right.
you would send somebody and they would jump on a boat and go somewhere. But this person could equally be assassinated or murdered or kidnapped.
Right, yeah.
And not that any of this is funny, but what it kind of highlighted was that, yes, we are in a new time, being with the AI age, but the issues of security, the issues of unforeseen circumstances have always been with us. And I'd really like to begin with that as how it's connected to kind of you, is that I've always found it so interesting how you have seen societies go through immense change. So, we can start nice and light and talk about how, you've studied, war crimes in the Balkans and things like that. I mean, we're not 3 minutes into the episode, but we can talk about war crimes. And I'm really interested, before we jump into the technology and the people, I'd really love to hear your thoughts or your views on, even before jumping to AI, when there's society and they're going through immense change, what are some of the things that usually lead up to those kinds of immense changes? Is there kind of like then an absolute like switch where it's like before and after this moment type thing, and then the rebuilding? So with that, I thought there's no one better than you to come and talk to us through the society evolution when it comes through, obviously, and then comparing that to where we are with AI. So that is my thinking around our episode for today.
Okay, well, lots of questions to respond to coming out of that. I think that what you kind of ended with, and that's the question of like, okay, the like transformation as a switch, before and after. In most types of change, right, processes or society, where societies have experienced some sort of massive disruption, it actually is difficult to identify that like one point in time. Right, so in countries that have experienced, for example, civil conflict, right? So even a question like, when did that conflict start? Was it when kind of the shooting started, or was it when there was a political breakdown, or was it when there was some sort of incident that happened preceding that? And then also, when does it end, right? Is it when kind of a peace agreement is signed, but there's still high levels of societal kind of suspicion, distrust, walls separating communities, for example? And that fluidity in terms of how we experience change cuts against how we talk about change, because we tend to assume that there's like a beginning and end, right, to any major kind of historical episode. And then apply that to technology, and what you mentioned early on is what makes AI different from other security challenges or other types of governance challenges that we've encountered in the past. Right, so if you think about AI and surveillance, right, that states have had the capacity to survey, and often you would use people to do that decades ago to survey. But there are a couple differences that have kind of been creeping up on us that we might not see without kind of perfect hindsight. And this is something that gets to the kind of broader governance conversation, is just how much data is out there about all of us, right? That we are, of course, not necessarily kind of live streaming our lives as such, but as a figure of speech, right? In a way, we are, right? All this data is out there about us. And then you look at that and you aggregate that, and what you can do with that type of information, what that enables in terms of not just the private sector, but also the public sector in terms of governance for good and bad, is something that previous generations did not have access to when thinking about governance or thinking about society. And I think that's an important difference. And so if you think about also this question of security, what type of security vulnerabilities do we have? Well, if an individual was somehow compromised, who was carrying a message in the past, right? To go back to the analogy, you would, if you identified that, be able to limit the exposure you have. But if your kind of data systems are compromised, right, and you don't know it, right, or even if you do know it, but you don't know how it's being or where it's being or what to do about it, the scale of the challenge and the potential harm that it can bring about has grown significantly, right? And so I think that part of this seeming like, oh, everybody now is talking about security when it comes to AI, or thinking about some of the kind of cybersecurity implications. I think that's natural, particularly when it comes to developments like agentic AI. But I also think, yes, it's helpful to look to the past for parallels and see kind of how we have addressed similar challenges, but to be careful not to apply the tools of the past to the challenges and problems that we are facing today, right? Because the nature of, or so the society that we're seeking to govern has changed how it communicates, right? I'll use a very kind of, if we go back 100 years, for example, I also teach on a kind of international program at a university, and one of the things that's interesting to observe, or just like to think about, is that, well, 100 years ago, for example, you could not have international programs the way you do today, with people from all these different continents coming together, right? Like if you were going to travel intercontinentally, it would probably be like a once in a life, or maybe twice in a life, or maybe if you're super, super wealthy, right, a few times, right? But these journeys take a lot of time. And then once you go someplace else, you need to learn the language, adapt life, right? It's a lifetime commitment. But in the 2020s, of course, it's something that for young people in a lot of different parts of the world, that's kind of natural. Well, think about like, which country do you want to study in, right? So on the one hand, right, mobility has increased, but also if you think about the world in which they live, if you come to a country like Japan, for example, you remain connected on social media with all your friends back home, right? You can have friends also, make new friends, like virtually, who are on different continents. And also you can remain in your like own media environment from back home. You can kind of keep watching your favorite series, you can keep doing all this, right? And so the world, right, the kind of the experiences that people have today are much more interconnected than they were in the past. And if you think about that in terms of AI and governance, right, that's also true, right? Because what we're seeing at a very individual level, your own kind of personal experiences, how you are experiencing the world, has also changed. For example, business, right? Think about supply chains, think about all these other elements of interconnectivity. And so it's an interesting time to be talking about that in 2026, of course, because it seems that, well, a lot of those institutions that facilitated that interconnectedness are under increasing stress. But there's no way, I mean, right now, right, think about it, to kind of pull back, right, the turn back the clock when it comes to these types of societal and individual level changes and how technology has changed our lives, right? So the policy responses to that would reflect the world we live in today, not 100 years ago.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I think the point that I want to dive a little bit more into is when you mentioned that the tools of yesterday can certainly inform, but shouldn't necessarily form our approach to tomorrow, right? So use them as for an informative rather than a formative approach. And I think this is interesting and almost an opportunity to maybe even break down or even define the idea of sovereignty and digital sovereignty. So
yes.
I remember, so I'm from an island, even though I have a very odd accent, it's still an Australian accent to some extent. I remember my grandmother telling me during the Second World War, in the papers, they basically told, so they being the government of Australia, told everybody, don't worry, the war will not reach our borders.
Right. Because
we're an island and the Japanese have bicycles. And how are they going to get from Japan to here? Honestly, there was a front page cover with a Japanese person on a bicycle and the Australians on land kind of looking safe and kind of laughing.
Right.
And then I said, well, how did that end up? She goes, well, Darwin was bombed.
Right.
You know?
Right. So, aviation.
Aviation. And so the idea that sovereignty used to be, this is my land, you're in your land, but that's very much not what sovereign means anymore.
Yes, so this is a very good question, right? So we're talking about sovereignty itself. I'd like to focus on, though, I think you mentioned digital sovereignty there, because I think that's something that is increasingly talked about and is something that a lot of states have begun to embrace. Now, there's sovereignty as we knew it in the past century, and and how we see the world is actually very much informed by sovereignty, right? If you were to imagine, for example, a world map, you would imagine a world map with state borders, right? That's like you've closed your eyes, right? Yeah, flags in all the countries, and of course, kind of the reality of geography is different, but nonetheless, that's what informed how we see sovereignty. It's territorial, it's linked to kind of a population and political authority, and all these things were nicely aligned. And in this world that I described that had emerged with kind of this deep interconnectedness and also fluidity and mobility, what sovereignty kind of means in practice has begun to shift. And it's shifted so much now that policymakers are beginning to look for tools, right? Like, okay, so if you think about other kind of strategic industries in the 20th century, like the steel industry, right? So this was something that was kind of closely associated with national power. It was something that you could subsidize, prop up, and even the smallest of countries could have their own steel mill and locally produced steel, right? And so that mindset is informing, unfortunately, how some people think about digital sovereignty. So if we just build the data centers, right, or if we just have a national champion, like a kind of a foundational model, right, that is developed domestically within our country, right, we have our own digital ecosystem that we can stick our flag to and feel better about ourselves. But as you know, as somebody who kind of works in this field, that it's actually much more complex than that. If you think about, for example, where tech companies get funding, right, this often crosses borders. And if you also think about data centers themselves, the question of like, well, who owns the data center, right? And you think about data centers that are built in different parts of the world as part of these initiatives to increase a state's data sovereignty. Well, most of the know-how, operators, and also kind of the rules governing them come from outside, right? So you might have, on the one hand, increased a particular capacity, but that doesn't really fit your understanding of sovereignty, but is being used as an indicator to measure sovereignty, right? And so in this particular context, then, the traditional tools, right, to bring about sovereignty or to achieve sovereignty are tools that were honed in an era where you were governing something that was less internet connected and less complex. Mm-hmm. And also, when I say interconnectedness, I'm not just talking about interconnectedness across borders, but I'm saying interconnectedness within the AI ecosystem itself, right? So if you think about, okay, you have these different regulatory instruments that are governing different parts of it, like you might be thinking about kind of the services aspect, or you might be thinking about the kind of design aspect through the EU AI Act, mm-hmm. or you might be thinking about like platforms. All of these are interconnected, meaning that if you are thinking about regulating one particular aspect, you might begin to feel like you're playing whack-a-mole, right? In terms of governance. Mm-hmm. And also, as we mentioned, like the elements of change, mm-hmm. right, that is taking place is one that it seems obvious when you talk about it in a conversation like this, but in terms of kind of groupthink, right, when you have people in a room thinking about, okay, so what can we do to achieve digital sovereignty, they tend to fall back on some of the same kind of indicators that I mentioned before.
And if we think about digital sovereignty as, for example, sovereignty, maybe right. we don't even need the word digital, like maybe it's just sovereignty in 2026. If we think about traditionally like sovereignty and what that means, it's deeply emotive to people. If you were to take somebody's flag and burn right. it versus fly it, right? People have deeply emotional reactions to this. But if you were to ask somebody, for example, how they feel about the data center or their own data, for example, I have not seen such a natural human response to that. And I'm wondering, the symbols of flag, the symbols of nation, who are you, who you are not. And there's even almost many people who listen to our podcast are similar to us, so either global professionals in Japan or Japanese professionals globally. And we always get the question, where are you from? Where are you from? Right. These kind. Now, as you kind of mentioned, there's this switch of like, when did change kind of happen? When did this borderless, kind of change? Well, perhaps there's also elements of the fact that you could, for example, my husband is Mexican. I have an Australian Mexican child, so. There's the borders are, for example, now in many circumstances are kind of surpassed. Right. And so I'm thinking it's quite interesting if we go back to like the symbolism of a flag, and I'm wondering, will we get to a point where people feel so deeply passionate about their digital sovereignty as they do kind of national sovereignty? And if they did, like, what would that look like?
This is interesting. I think this gets to one of the reasons why this conversation is beginning to have this kind of outsized presence, because it resonates with people's sense of identity, right? So if you look at digital sovereignty conversations in different contexts, they mean different things, right? So if you were to take some American understandings of this term, of which there are many. We can get into that maybe a little bit later, but one would see this as, well, digital sovereignty means that American tech firms should not be subjected to foreign regulatory oversight, right? And that's very emotive, right? So it's talking about like, well, these are US companies and these are foreign regulators, right? Which creates kind of this very zero-sum image of kind of digital sovereignty and the digital space. For others, it's a developmental goal, right? Our country's facing developmental challenges, right? There's this remarkable new technology. Does it have the potential to level the playing field? Can countries skip certain stages of development? And therefore, we won't ask a lot of questions about, well, we don't, data centers, right, what they're actually doing, right, what kind of individual data protections at that level, right? And so I wanted to just put a caveat to what I said earlier, simply because while our experiences are much more interconnected, and while kind of the technological infrastructure is much more interconnected, we still live in a world of nation states,
yeah.
right? Perhaps the most important, I guess, identifying marker that people possess would be their passport, right? And being kind of the country from it, as you mentioned, also, it's also a very emotive kind of identity as well. And you do have models of digital sovereignty where countries have sought to essentially develop their own ecosystems domestically, right? So China being kind of the biggest example of that. But of course, China with a large population, and China with kind of very top-down governance where national leaders establish very ambitious targets when it comes to, even before AI, other digital goals. And then also as a country that's seeking to export its technologies through mechanisms like the digital Silk Road, right? You can, the flag is very visible, right, in that sense. But most countries in the world are not the US or China, right, obviously. And how do those countries then see digital sovereignty, right? So if you think about interconnectedness, I think one of the places where this is most visible, where you're seeing conversations of governance, but also challenges associated with governance coming to a head, is Europe, which is not too surprising because the European Union was an early mover in terms of attempting to regulate artificial intelligence. But you are seeing now in 2026 kind of a significant distance between the ambitions that originally surrounded early discussions around the EU AI Act to now the EU Omnibus, right, which is arguably taking a step back from some of the larger ambitions or that the European Union once had when it came to governance in this particular realm. In large part, also because different EU member states now see digital sovereignty differently, right? So if we are to look to France, right, France is one that's seeking to create national champions. And have created national champions. But these national champions also exist with this very, very kind of deeply interdependent kind of network of either funding or kind of bringing their products to market, which means that it's not like the kind of a French-owned steel mill, right? In terms of actually being a indicator or being a kind of sovereign entity, the way, I guess, paradoxically, some of the kind of Chinese counterparts might be in a system where you have a top-down kind of state picking those national champions within the technology sector. So immense challenges, right? And I think this is one of the interesting aspects about this conversation is it's very easy to move to kind of almost caricature extremes of sovereignty and interdependence, like this kind of world where, okay, well, nation states matter less. I would argue that very few people in 2026 are seriously making that claim that nation states matter less today in the 2020s than they did in the past, given the level of geopolitical tension that you are seeing in the world today. But the combination of kind of technological change and societal change means that how we address problems of government-to-government relations in the 2020s is going to change, right? And so I think this is one of the big questions in terms of where this technological space will lead to. Are we going to be in a world where it's possible to have many different digital sovereigns, right? Or in a world where there are maybe two digital sovereigns, right? And then you're kind of in these different camps between the two, right? And so, like, if you think about, like, what does digital sovereignty mean? In different countries, like I said, it means different things, right? So some countries might see digital sovereignty as saying, okay, well, let's distance ourselves from the US tech ecosystem, right? Whereas others might have an opposite view. And some are also thinking about kind of rethinking, as you mentioned at the very beginning, how we think of sovereignty in a world where you have a few very large big tech players, right? And interesting here, there are historical parallels, right? As well. Yeah.
That is also definitely terribly interesting. I'd like to unpack a few things there. I think the first thing is, as you mentioned, there's two players, right? So it's either the US or China. Now this is, I reflect a lot on this, not being from the US nor being from China.
Right.
And for a couple of reasons. One is, does that just mean there's like a haves and a have-nots? Like there's an AI haves and an AI have-nots, and that's kind of like it? Is that really all we have? And then another interesting approach is, as you said, there's like the US approach, which is also quite culturally informed in a way. So for example, if you take the foundation model of Grok. Now Grok's like flag in the ground is truth. You know, the Grok's, like the number one factor is Grok should be truth seeking. Right. And then, for example, you have, on the other hand, you have, for example, China's many foundation models, one of which, for example, is DeepSeek, and is an open, or they've taken a different approach and had it be an open model. Yeah. And so Malaysia, as of 2026, I mean, things are always changing, so but it's 2026 February, that Malaysia has adopted DeepSeek as their national model, which I think is really interesting. And then does, for example, in this moment, do you need to have, you know, what would the theatrics of an American delegation to Malaysia be, where it's like, oh, coming and yes, let's, you know, have our good relationships and, you know, yoroshiku onegaishimasu and all that kind of stuff. That's one thing. But then if a country is using a foundation model of like another country, for example, of which you don't see eye to eye on many things, this is then informing not only the way that this entire country is operating, but also thinking and creating. This would, just the simple adoption of a foundation model means more than 1,000 delegation visits to a country.
Yeah, and exactly, and what you know about a country, right? I mean, because if you're thinking about this in the context of public services, and you're thinking about, okay, the need to digitize all these records that a state might have, right, so as to make these models useful, and then you think about who has access to that data, right? You're in a world where potentially the tech players from either side know way more about not just what's happening in your country, but in other countries as well through access to that data. And so this is where, if you're thinking about adoption and diffusion of technology, that China has a slightly different perspective here, that if you look at the rationale behind DeepSeek and making that open, is that the bet is that China can diffuse its models faster and easier than the US can, because the US tech ecosystem is embedded in kind of a highly monetized system in which you need countries to buy into, and also you don't want these models to open, right, because they're proprietary, and you have invested, or somebody has invested billions of dollars in that. And in some cases, and this is where, if you think about what conversations are happening, that could be something that could be disproportionately harmful to U.S. tech, right? As there is a perception that states are leveraging types of vulnerabilities that you have described in order to achieve different policy outcomes, right? And so there is a significant nervousness about this. And this is where, so Oscar Gustrain, who I had a conversation with on kind of digital sovereignty, where he likes to use the term digital autonomy, right? So as opposed to sovereignty, because what people are saying is digital sovereignty, but when you push them on it, they don't actually mean sovereignty. They're just using that because it's a word that everybody kind of understands. But the actual meaning of sovereignty, as we talked about earlier, is something that's very difficult to apply in the context of the technologies that we are talking about, and also the type of technological competition that we're talking about. So if you think about autonomy as a state, that's actually what you want. You want the ability to autonomously act, right? And that's the feature kind of sovereignty that you're really seeking to get at, not necessarily putting your flag on everything, right? And then you're going to start asking a different set of questions. And so, as you mentioned, there's differences in culture kind of between the US and China, but there's also differences of culture internally, right, within states and their foundation models, right? Even kind of between Grok and kind of OpenAI or Anthropic, right? You're noticing differences in terms of the ways these models make sense of and respond to and interact with users. And so if you're thinking about autonomy, you might be thinking about kind of value alignment. Now, of course, there are limitations to that, and those limitations are most visible when you begin to discuss sanctions, right? These companies cannot divorce themselves from the country that they are based in, and whatever that country's foreign policies goals are, whether that's like you're talking about Beijing or you're talking about Washington, right? And in that sense, right, I think that a lot of the conversations about digital sovereignty are actually a response to that nervousness, that if we are reliant on a company that is flagged in another state to provide kind of very basic things that we need and that we cannot do without, what's to prevent that kind of country from leveraging that dependency over us to get us to do things that we otherwise don't or would never do, right? And again, I think what you're looking at is this question of autonomy, and autonomy might actually come from a interdependent network, but of a different constellation of countries, different constellation of actors, different constellation of companies, right? That is not as narrow as this kind of idea of absolute sovereignty. So you could have countries or companies in countries with kind of similar sets of kind of values, right? That you might think about kind of data privacy as one. And then aligning to kind of work together to ensure that kind of basic level of data privacy protection across the board and kind of allow for easier interoperability across borders. But so conversely, right? Like what this interdependence means is that it's not that countries matter less, right? But it's that we need to have a greater awareness of and a greater understanding of who we are working with to provide us with something that we need, right? And what does that mean for our autonomy going forward, whether you're a government or a private firm?
That's very interesting. As someone who's Australian, I can speak to like fake autonomy. So fake autonomy is what we have in Australia, which
Okay.
is like, well, yes, Australia, you're a country, but if there's ever a war, we're the Commonwealth. And
Right.
all of a sudden, where's the Commonwealth? No, Australia, you're your own country, so you need a visa to work in the UK, but our royals' faces are all over your money. So like,
Right.
also like a very odd kind of situation. But just to kind of understand how deeply valuable this is, Eric Schmidt, who's the CEO or the ex-CEO of Google, who's deeply invested in the idea of perhaps AI or autonomy, and that he was mentioning in a recent keynote, under no circumstances can we risk just a few $1 billion for losing the race, losing the AI race. So,
Right.
and so this is where you're saying, okay, as you mentioned, the AI systems of the US are deeply embedded in financial models, as in who's making money from this, how we're making money from this, what's the business model. But he was saying, just to like understand how valuable this is, he's like, who cares about a few $1 billion if we lose the AI race? And I thought this is super interesting because I'm kind of seeing a little bit of a curve. So that we go from individual, the middle is kind of like a little bit gray and lots of organizations, and then there's the end user. So I'll tell you a little bit what I mean. So and perhaps this might have always been the case, but for me personally, I feel that politics is incredibly individual at the moment. So for example, it's not the US, it's Trump, it's not Japan, it's Takaichi, it's not France, it's Macron. Like they're individual people. Then there's this kind of like gray mass in the middle, which is like Washington or Beijing or some kind of, committees that sit somewhere. And then there's like the end person, me as a person. So it's like, how do you connect what's going on from like that individual, like country leadership? How do you navigate the gray? And then what does that then mean to someone that's getting up every day and just trying to run their business?
Oh, this is a great question because I think you're touching on kind of a couple different aspects here, right? That I can go into, and I think first you mentioned the AI race, right? In this framing, and it's like, okay, traditionally, if you want to kind of mobilize investment in something, right, you need to present a business model case that investors will invest in, and with the framing of the AI race, right, it's being framed as, well, this is existential for the country, right? And this is interesting because this gets back to kind of American understandings of digital sovereignty and sovereignty itself, right? That if somehow in this framing of the race, the U.S. is not out front, does not win it, right? Then that's it, right? For the U.S. And so therefore you need kind of an all of society kind of response to this, where kind of the government mobilizes private capital into making sure that the U.S. comes out in front. This is actually not, though, because this is interesting. Because you mentioned that this language people might associate with, oh, this sounds like all kind of the tech leaders who were surrounding Trump and who attended his inauguration, right? This is kind of their messaging.
The dinners at Mar-a-Lago.
Yes, exactly. the messaging, but the kind of the U.S. is kind of it was the Biden administration that came out with a AI strategy, right? And interestingly, in the forward framed the AI race using the exact same language, and also some of the exact same people who we were talking about were involved in the kind of the crafting of that commission that came out of a Biden administration presidential commission's report, right? So there has been a significant amount of continuity in terms of this framing of the AI race. But you mentioned kind of the Trump administration is doing a lot of things differently, not necessarily here, but in terms of AI governance, how it understands AI risks, kind of AI safety institutes, deconstruct, also kind of international cooperation when it comes to digital technologies. One of the things that the previous U.S. administration was supportive of was, for example, kind of the UN Digital Compact, right, which was a high watermark for international cooperation when it comes to AI and sustainable development, and also some of the more ambitious goals that framed AI as a catalyst in kind of a win-win technological race that can decrease global inequality rather than increase global inequality. And also in terms of AI governance, right, more broadly, the previous administration had a very different approach to risk and safety and was embedding the US into this growing network of AI safety institutes, and also was part of a whole lot of conversations that also went beyond kind of civil governance of AI to looking at military applications of AI and the such. And so there, the Trump administration has taken a very different approach, right? The U.S. policy is completely kind of reversed on these issues, and policy is less predictable, right? The policy process of the previous administration has not been replicated, right? And that's kind of a long-standing kind of policy process that then means that, well, U.S. policy could be something one day, but then I guess, I don't know what the word, the president truths something out, and then something is radically changed. And this is interesting in a sense that this is not just, again, not just kind of the Trump administration in the U.S., but this increasingly kind of personalistic approach to governance with world leaders today, right? So as mentioned, kind of Takaichi's election in Japan, right? A lot of focus on the prime minister, as a person, but then forgetting there's like a cabinet office and there's a political party and there's ministries, right, that are all influential in these processes. And then also if you think about how, of course, Xi, very different in China, right, discussing, but there are all these constraints, right, regardless of what leader we are talking about. And that's the gray area of the process that you were talking about. And so for people like looking at this from the outside, what you'd want to do is look, okay, what do you identify as the policy problem? Or what are leaders talking about as the problem? Is a good indicator that will tell you a lot about like what the subsequent policy process will look like, right? And that's why I think conversations about digital sovereignty are very important, because that's at the stage, okay, so what's the problem, right? What is it we are trying to achieve, right? And there are different ways of different visions of that, but some of them might actually be harmful in the sense that, yes, the things that could have made you more sovereign in the past are actually going to increase your vulnerabilities and dependencies in the present today. And kind of this, what does this mean for the average person? Well, I think this is very important. I think this is something that people don't think about sometimes enough. That often, when it comes to issues that we might think are very important, for example, like data privacy or cybersecurity, individual users might think, oh, well, what's wrong? So just to use like another kind of parallel, if you think about like OpenAI and ChatGPT's kind of subscription models, right? People upload all sorts of potential, like personal identifying information, potentially proprietary information, for all sorts of reasons, right? And they don't think a lot about what that means for them. And in fact, for most people, there's probably not going to be a individual like
huge
repercussions. But if you think about this at an aggregate level, well, this provides one particular kind of firm with a whole lot of data that otherwise they would never have had access to. And you mentioned Malaysia earlier, and other countries are thinking about, well, if you have all that very kind of cultural specific knowledge about our society, then going into training something that we have no insight into or no control over, that potentially one day, if relations break down between our countries, could be used in all sorts of ways that we're not thinking about, right? Then that is a concern, right? And I think that for those who are thinking about these conversations, to think about kind of, well, there's different levels of individual, I guess, stakes that are at play in this conversation. So it's much more important, right, than perhaps some other policy debates,
Yeah.
right, that you might or might not be following because of its knock-on effects. And when I say these knock-on effects, right, if you think about, if you look at policy responses that might actually make it more difficult to work with collaborators in different countries. A lot of these co-creation spaces on the internet, you don't really know a lot about the other people who are kind of helping to refine something, right? And so you might find yourself in a situation where you're just somebody kind of in the US or Australia working on something collaboratively in a collaborative space, but you've been working with somebody who's kind of in China, right? And then you might find that, oh, you've contributed to, right? Or you might find that you've fallen foul of some domestic legislation that is aimed at enhancing your country's own digital sovereignty. Now, what would the effect be? Well, the effect would be probably rather chilling, right, on all of those creative spaces, like your own people's ability to engage in those spaces. Would people just like simply like, okay, well, I don't want to risk this, right? And tune out, but then these spaces will still exist, right? And so it's for those who are kind of involved in the cutting edge of this sector, right, or the sphere. These are really important conversations because they might impact upon your ability to go about creating what it is you have been creating in a way that you might not have thought about, right? And it might also just like creep up on you out of the blue, right? Like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that this was even something that I shouldn't or somebody should not be doing. And so that's why these broader conversations are incredibly valuable. So I think in terms of the gray space, to what to look out for is, we'll look at how the problem is being formulated, right? How it's being articulated. Of course, you won't get insight into like the back room, right? But that will tell you a lot about the kind of the direction of travel. So like look at how different countries talk about digital sovereignty, right?
Yeah. And if we think about an AI sovereignty, or even just AI or a country's approach to AI, it requires one fundamental thing, which is it requires the society to get behind it.
Yes.
It requires every single person in the society to say, yes, this is for us, we're going to use it. So it's not just you can develop it, but people have to adopt it. The actual adoption of the technology is also key. And we've seen, as we've kind of mentioned in this podcast a few times, that you can certainly have the past inform, but it can't certainly form, where we're going to tomorrow. So I think the informative thing that we can take from the past, from getting people, behind systems, is that, why did people believe in their country? Let's take, for example, America. Americans love their flag. They love their flag. They love the American dream because they saw the results. They saw, if I do these things, I then get there, right? There was a very linear path. They achieved it. People around them, they achieved it. People on the other side of the country achieved it. It became like, this is a thing that we can do together. And I trust if I get involved in this system, it'll take me there. Right. I think when it comes to that, what would the digital American kind of dream look like, right? And you can replace America for whichever country you like. But how are you going to get your society to adopt the technology? And then I think the results factor, is also quite interesting because like the Americans, it's like, yes, there is that kind of rags to riches story that the Americans love, and they've seen it multiple times. Right. And I think people haven't seen that yet with AI. Right. They've seen big companies get even more rich through investment from other big companies, right? But I don't think we've seen the rags to riches story as much yet that helps people believe and trust in a system that they have in the past.
Right, this is interesting. So there are a couple elements to this question, and one relates to essentially kind of the future of work in AI, right? Like, will anybody like have a job, right? And the anxieties that creates. So as I mentioned, right, that there's a large push to kind of center AI in the broader conversation of U.S. technological competition, right? You might think in the 20th century, a parallel would be like, for example, the space race, right, where all the tremendous amount of kind of government money was put in to making sure that, well, the U.S. wasn't the first kind of in space, the U.S. would be the first on the moon, right? And similarly, you have that mobilization here. I think the question of adoption for a country like the U.S. is less of a challenge, in part because the U.S. dominates kind of platforms that can bring things to market, meaning that, for example, if you were a country that was pushing your own foundational model and you had adversarial relations with the U.S. and you're a small country, you're not going to be on the Apple Store. Right. So like a Cuban foundational model, for example, if one, right, would not end up there, right? And because that kind of broader kind of platform ecosystem is right now like so U.S. dominated, that's less of a challenge. But the second part is what you mentioned is going to be a problem, right? As people perceive, okay, well, there's this AI technological race, AI is creating fabulous amounts of wealth for those big players in this industry. But from the perspective of a university computer science graduate in 2026, there are no jobs for me, right? That would have existed just 5 years ago, right? And from the perspective of those already working, right, in these fields, companies are getting smaller in terms of workforce, not larger, right? I'd have to go back and double check with this, but even like these large data centers that consume vast amounts of electricity and process vast amounts of data, it's not like going to visit a factory in a sense. Like there are very few human beings who need to work there, right? So you're using a large amount of land, right? You're using a large amount of resources, but comparatively, you're not really creating jobs through bringing data centers, for example, to your kind of state. If you're in the U.S., you're bringing different kinds of investment, but not necessarily creating jobs and creating wealth at the lower end. And in a country where you do have significantly more than Japan, right? Greater inequality. This is going to be a challenge for how we move forward. Of course, this is not the first time that the U.S. has experienced this kind of like economic dislocation. We were talking about steel earlier, right? Go to former steel producing parts of the U.S. today, right? A lot of these are kind of long-term economically depressed communities. What is AI going to do for the average person in the context, as you mentioned, that broad American dream that you had kind of described so eloquently earlier, right? Well, that really remains to be seen. And in order to continue to mobilize this kind of consistent support, one would need to address that. And this is interesting. There are, despite that you mentioned that we tend to focus on leaders in the world today, despite kind of the Trump administration's reflexive distrust of regulation in this sector, at the state level in the U.S., you have a whole host of initiatives, right, to kind of mitigate risk or to do things as simple as, well, if AI is interacting with a customer, then it should be kind of disclosed, right, that you are interacting kind of with AI, kind of at that level. There seems to be a growing kind of consensus that this type of kind of governance is necessary. And interestingly, when there was an attempt to kind of put this into another piece of legislation, there were opponents from Donald Trump's own party, right? We're like, well, wait a second, no, this is something that would help people, right? And so there is a growing conversation about this, and it's something that definitely will kind of increase, right? It's only there's only going to be more people talking about this as the real effects of AI begin to be felt more broadly in the economy.
Yeah. We're big on AI literacy,
right.
But your minimum viable literacy. What's the minimum viable literacy that you need in AI in order to be a contributing member of society or to thrive? This is something that we often
I would say there's so one thing that in conversations that sometimes is surprising, and this gets back a little bit to the beginning of our conversation about kind of societal breakdowns or societal transformation, is that for users with very little literacy, meaning that this is just something else that they've downloaded on their phone, just another app, right? Yeah. There isn't an understanding of how their data that they're sharing is being used, or kind of what this or how this model thinks, right?
Or E10, right? There's a lack of understanding as to how good it can be or how risky it can be. It's just like on both ends.
Yes, exactly. So it's like kind of this idea of just you're using it for relatively kind of simple and straightforward tasks. You don't understand its potential, but then you're putting this like disproportionate trust into something that you don't really understand, but you're not really using it the right way.
Either,
right? Because you don't understand that, well, it's not going to really be able to help you if it hasn't been trained on any kind of data that is relevant to whatever you are talking about, or whatever kind of conversation that you're seeking to elicit from it. And so I think just understanding, and I think this kind of lifting the veil a little bit without getting too technical behind LLMs, for example. And I think this is actually another element, minimum level of AI literacy, is people tend, when you say AI, to immediately think about large language models.
Right,
Only, exclusively.
Yeah.
Without understanding kind of the larger ecosystem, like you might think about computer vision or kind of all the other kind of elements. And then when people are like, oh, well, I don't really need to worry about AI because I asked ChatGPT to create a map of my country and it put the cities in the wrong place. Oh, this is so stupid.
Yeah.
Right. So why are we even talking about security, or why are we having all these other kind of conversations about it? That in itself is a marker of somebody who's just being exposed, like trying to learn, but doesn't really understand the technology, but then coming to this like conclusion, this broad sweeping conclusion that we don't need to worry about this.
It's like, go back to either the late 90s or early 2000s and saying this internet thing is so stupid, takes so long to, dial up, for example.
Yes.
Not seeing that, the potential. You want to do a quick check? Okay. So, for example, with the internet, and then not seeing, for example, the potential. What I would like to closing up with is reflecting on kind of where you have come from, which is the idea of international relations, and seeing societies rebuild. And sometimes, obviously, there's horrific things that a society can go through. But we've seen time and time again in humanity that even after a fundamental shift, we've seen societies build back and thrive. And we've even seen some societies miss entire blocks of what we would say is kind of like linear development. So, for example, many countries in Africa, or even many countries in Southeast Asia, didn't do dial-up internet. They have no memories of what it's like to go to bed and wait for 2 songs to download or something. That was never their life. They went from nothing to running an entire business through WhatsApp, right? So super interesting. So not everyone has to have the same journey. And so I'd love to think from what we have seen in the past and what you've seen societies go through as they've rebuilt, what does a real thriving society have in common? As in, they've gone through massive change and they've now set themselves up for a real element of success, whatever that might look like. what are some lessons that we might learn from and then apply for obviously some of the changes that society is really going through now?
Okay, so broadly speaking, I would say that one thing that you do see in common in places or in societies that have experienced significant traumatic events or dislocations such as conflict is the complete breakdown of trust.
Oh.
Not just trust between kind of the person and a state or some governing authority that might have abused that trust through committing serious human rights abuses or doing other things, but also at a very interpersonal level as well, not trusting your neighbors.
So I lived in East Germany for a while.
Yes.
I didn't,
yes,
so
exactly.
I lived in Berlin for like 10 years. Yeah.
Yes, right, exactly. And so this will resonate,
that
right?
was like even you felt it in the staircases, like still.
Yes, exactly. It's who is this person? Why are they talking to me? What are they, yeah, right. This kind of immediate kind of sense, or what do they want from me, or how are they going to kind of leverage whatever this is, or all of these are symptoms of a breakdown, kind of in trust. And one of the things that, when kind of thinking about transitions, that sometimes is overlooked is that element of trust needs to be rebuilt first, right? So you can create a kind of governmental commission or a public inquiry, or you can do all of these things, right? But if nobody trusts the state, nobody wants to talk to the state, right? Then that's going to limit the effectiveness of whatever you're trying to do at kind of a macro policy level. And here, right, getting back to like these changes, and you're mentioning that different countries have different experiences, and this also highlights different levels of trust in technology, right? So you might think about, you lived in Germany. Why are Germans so distrustful of technology, right? Why are conversations about, for example, data privacy or kind of cameras in public places so much more visceral in a German context than they would be in Australia or anywhere in Southeast Asia, right? Where people might just be like, well, yeah, it's just kind of a public space, so why not? Right, so there are different equilibrium points, right, of what cultures and societies will tolerate, and it's not one size fits all, right? So in the conversation on AI governance and also AI futures, right, while the world is interconnected and while these ecosystems are interdependent, kind of what AI governance might look like in one place can, on the margins, and will very likely differ in another place, meaning that this could mean that there's a greater tolerance, where some countries might see data centers, even if they're fully privately owned and foreign owned, as some sort of marker of linear development, as you mentioned, right? Or as a way to skip different developmental kind of milestones that we tend to associate. And therefore, right, we are in a world where lots of conversations are focused on digital sovereignty. There are lots of different visions of digital sovereignty. We are very interconnected, but that landscape is shifting and changing constantly beneath our feet, which means we need to have just a better awareness of this, right? And that awareness will help us better understand policy shifts that are happening, and hopefully will allow for changes when they do happen to not like totally come out of blue, and also erode our trust in these processes. Although, of course, there probably will be some developments that will, right, and should lead us to question our trust. So.
I think trust is actually perhaps the word that was connecting perhaps everything. So for example, even if we're kind of reflecting on like the American dream, I guess one of the reasons, if you're thinking about, shall I participate in this new system or in this new economy or not, it's because people trust their participation is going to mean something. It's going to result in something. So, all right, so thinking about an AI economy and an AI economy to thrive, I mean, one thing, obviously, I mean, at DTJ, we always are talking about literacy. However, I think we're going to have to look at trust now, perhaps a little bit more deeply. I think it's always been there, but I don't know if we've kind of like put a stamp on it, like putting words to it, kind of like as you have today.
And it'd be interesting also, just like in conversations, just like are there different like models that people just intrinsically for no good reason trust more than another one, and then ask why that is, like and also maybe at what level would your trust like stop, right? Like
when is okay, when is not okay,
Right, exactly. Like recently had a conversation with a commercial airline pilot who works on certifying or who does research on certification of kind of digital flight instruments, right? And of course you can't have kind of autonomous instruments right now in civil aviation, but the question is that, well, it really boils down to is just, will people trust getting on a plane one day without human pilots, right? Probably not for the near time. And when you would think about like there's all these social interactions that happen during flight, or all these things that might happen. For example, a medical emergency or a disruptive passenger. Whereas if you have like a human being who is the captain, right, who makes decisions on whether to land the plane or not, right?
Oh, that's so without opening up like a whole other kind of worms. I think that's so interesting because the way in which societies also approach trust is really interesting. So, for example, I remember we had a hypothetical situation we're running with a few policymakers, but they were not just Japanese policymakers; they were also from abroad, and it was interesting. Most of the participants from either Southeast Asia or Africa said that they wouldn't use AI for invoices. And I was like, that's interesting. I wonder why would you not?
Right.
And then their reasoning was, if something goes wrong, who's responsible?
Right.
And I thought, that would never kind of like came across my kind of value stack.
Right.
That didn't kind of, I was like, yes, invoices, AI, yes, thank you.
Yes.
But they were like, no, who's
who's
going to apologize?
Yes, exactly.
That was their thing. Yeah. Who's going to say sorry? And I thought, so interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So in that sense, right? Like we don't have until you're able to think in those terms, right? And also different, as I mentioned, different cultural perspectives on what trust means, how trust is achieved, how trust can be lost. All of these vary, and I think this is one of the challenges you might think about in terms of the broader conversation about a technology that tends to focus on learn from data at an aggregate level might miss some of these nuances, and therefore you might find something, it's kind of very well suited for like a American consumer or a Australian consumer, but then is very distrusted in a different part of the world, even though nothing is different in terms of how it operates.
Chris, thank you so much for joining. I feel like this has to be a part one. I feel
yes.
Part two. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I think certainly, my reflections of today, certainly we can use the past to inform, but definitely not form for tomorrow. We have to think very seriously about where we are. And then again, as society, we've kind of like done this all the time, which is like just try to be better, right? Just try to be better than we were yesterday, and to take that to the future, but then to also very deeply think about your own systems of trust. What does that look like? And then how to apply that in your own teams, in your own business. Because as you mentioned, if we look about societies that are thriving societies, they do trust their neighbors.
Right.
And so what kind of steps can you take in your own environment to literally trust your neighbor?
Absolutely. Right. So I think this is definitely a conversation we should continue at some point.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks.
We'll see you very soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.